Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something pretty cool. We are stepping straight into the metaphorical command center of a centrally planned socialist economy. Why? Well, to see exactly how it solves the absolute most fundamental questions of production. If you ever wondered how an entire nation's resources can literally be managed without relying on a free market, you are in the right place. We're going to break down the mechanics, the goals, and the structure of this whole system using data and concepts straight from our source material.
So, let's dive right in. Look, every society on Earth faces the exact same universal economic dilemma, right? Before anything gets built, shipped, or consumed, a society has to figure out three crucial things: what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom. It's basically a massive puzzle, and different economic systems, they just have completely different ways of solving it.
Now notice the direct contrast in how these systems operate. On one side, capitalist economies heavily rely on the price mechanism. This is that automatic, decentralized system where the spending habits of millions of sovereign consumers and the profit motives of producers act as this invisible hand guiding the economy. But in the socialist economy, that invisible hand is completely replaced. It's swapped out for a highly visible, conscious central planning authority. So instead of millions of individual choices steering the ship, a centralized body takes the wheel.
Think of our agenda here as the blueprint for this grand control room. We'll look at the central planning authority itself, then what and how much to produce, how to produce it, and finally, for whom, meaning how wealth actually gets distributed.
Moving right along to Section 1, the Central Planning Authority, which is really the engine of the socialist economy. Let's actually step inside this futuristic command center we've been talking about. Here, government planners take on the total responsibility for mapping, controlling, and managing all economic activities. There are absolutely no private firms making independent choices based on market trends. Instead, a specific planning commission, or ministry, acts as the central planning authority. In a socialist economy, this central body plays the exact same fundamental role that the price mechanism plays in a capitalist system. It's the core engine driving every single major economic decision, actively calculating exactly what the nation needs.
Now for Section 2, what and how much to produce. Basically, mapping the nation's resources.
Moving over to the first major data display in our control room, the planners have to figure out what and exactly how much the nation actually needs to manufacture. But without consumers signaling their preferences through price changes and spending habits, how do they know? Well, imagine looking at massive, holographic data charts mapping the entire country. The planners use these precise inputs to dictate the nation's entire output. First, they estimate the available economic resources, like what raw materials do we actually have? Then, human resources, who can work and where. Finally, they combine all that data with an evaluation of the people's needs and overall national priorities. They aren't looking at what products yield the highest profit margins. They're looking at what the nation requires as a whole.
All right, Section 3. How to produce, which is all about balancing efficiency and social goals.
Once they know what to make, say they're building a massive new railway or producing 1 million pairs of shoes, our central planners have to decide exactly how it should be produced. They have to choose the techniques. And this brilliantly illustrates a key difference in the socialist framework. See, in a purely capitalist system, a firm chooses a production method based almost entirely on minimizing factor prices to maximize profit. If machines are cheaper than human labor, they use machines. But the Central Planning Authority has a dual mandate. They absolutely look at the economic efficiency of different techniques, but they must balance that against broader social objectives and development goals. For example, they might intentionally choose a slightly more labor-intensive method if one of the major national goals is generating more employment opportunities.
And that brings us to Section 4, for whom? Distributing wealth and dividing the output.
Finally, we reach what's probably the most complex part of our command center: deciding for whom this wealth is generated and who gets what. Since production and distribution are so closely interlinked, to understand how output is divided among citizens, we really have to look at ownership. In a socialist economy, all productive resources are owned by the government, period. There are no private factory owners earning profits, no private landlords collecting rent, and no private financiers earning interest. Because the state owns all these productive resources, the distribution of income is entirely managed by the planning authority, with citizens participating strictly as wage-earning laborers.
Picture workers building massive national infrastructure, right under a giant banner displaying this core principle, from each according to his capacity and to each according to his work. This single sentence essentially dictates how society's output is fairly shared in this economic model. Simply put, it means people contribute based on their abilities, and they are compensated based on the actual work they perform.
So how is that actually put into practice? Well, to fulfill that guiding principle, the government explicitly calculates and fixes the wages for different categories of laborers. And they do this based strictly on two things: the quantity of the work done and the quality of the work done. The Central Planning Authority assesses these metrics and literally fixes the appropriate wage. You don't have a free labor market where supply and demand are constantly shifting your salary. The state determines the value of your labor directly. Let's take a look at how this trickles down into the everyday life of a citizen in this system. When workers take their government-fixed wages and go out to buy consumer items, they do not face freely operating forces of demand and supply. In a capitalist system, if a toy gets super popular, its price skyrockets. But in a socialist economy, prices for consumer goods are administered or fixed directly by the government. The state decides exactly what an item should cost, entirely regardless of sudden spikes in consumer demand.
Now you might be wondering, why build this incredibly intricate, centralized system in the first place? Well, the source material makes the objective very clear. The entire mechanics of this command center, the state ownership, the fixed wages based on work quality and quantity, and those administered consumer prices, they are designed specifically to drastically reduce income inequalities across the entire population. The overarching goal here is to ensure that wealth isn't just concentrated at the top and that everyone is able to get an adequate income to actually meet their needs.
As we power down our holographic charts at the end of this explainer, we are left to ponder a pretty massive question. We've seen how the socialist economy theoretically solves the fundamental problems of production through a central planning authority, aiming for these big social goals and reduced inequality. But considering the sheer scale of human needs, the millions of daily transactions, and the infinite complexities of a modern nation, what are the true mechanical limits of central economic planning? Could a single room of planners ever process enough data to perfectly map and manage an entire nation's economy? It's a fascinating structural question to leave you with. Thanks for hanging out in the command center with me today, and keep questioning how the systems around you are built.